after the flop peace show in Islamabad, tensions have once again escalated in the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical oil shipping route. Just a few days before the two-week ceasefire deadline ends, US President Donald Trump has ordered a naval blockade targeting Iranian shipping after talks between the US and Iran collapsed. The Strait of Hormuz, already considered the world's most sensitive energy choke point, is now on edge amid rising military and political tensions. According to reports, the United States is set to enforce a naval blockade beginning 7:30 p.m. And we're talking Indian Standard Time on the 13th of April. The U.S. Central Command says the operation will specifically target vessels traveling to and from Iranian ports and will apply to ships of all nationalities. Officials, however, clarified that transit to non-Iranian destinations will remain unaffected, meaning the Strait of Hormuz will remain open to general commercial shipping outside Iranian-linked routes. The plan reportedly includes interception operations and minesweeping measures as part of the blockade strategy. Trump has also drawn a nuclear red line, issuing strong warnings about Iran's nuclear ambitions. He stated that Iran will not be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons, warning of severe global consequences if it does. He also claimed Iran is in a very weak state with its military and manufacturing capabilities significantly degraded.
Navy is underwater, you know that. 158 ships are gone. Their Navy's gone. Most of their mine droppers are gone. We have a lot of people, as you know, at 10 o'clock tomorrow, we have a blockade going into effect. That'll be 10 o'clock tomorrow. Other nations are working so that Iran will not be able to sell oil, and that will be very effective. But what we want to do is we want to, and again, we don't need it. What we notice and what we see and what I think is maybe my idea, maybe not, I don't know. But there are many boats heading toward our country to fill up with oil and then go and take it. So they're not going to go through the Hormuz Strait. I think Iran is in very bad shape. I think they're very desperate. We had a meeting that lasted 21 hours. We understand the situation better than anybody, and Iran's in very bad shape. And just so you understand, Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. Will not have. There is no way that they're going to get. They still want it, and they made that clear the other night. Iran will not have a nuclear weapon.
So Donald Trump says Iranian Navy is very weak. The Iranian Navy chief Shahram Irani has dismissed reported blockade threat, calling it ridiculous and funny. He claimed that Iranian forces are closely tracking U.S. military movements in the entire region, signaling that Tehran remains fully alert and operational. They have further claimed that Iran will not be deterred by pressure or military posturing. On the ground, the impact is already becoming visible in the Strait of Hormuz. Oil tankers are reportedly turning back. Some are waiting outside the critical waterway, while others are switching off their tracking systems amid rising uncertainty. Now, since April 11th, only around 17 vessels have successfully transited the strait. Overall, maritime traffic in the Gulf has dropped by more than 200 ships and passage through the corridor, and it's no longer guaranteed, clearly. Movement has become selective, uncertain, and increasingly dependent on conditions set by both sides. Reports suggest Iran is continuing to allow limited maritime movement, effectively controlling the flow without fully closing the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, United States is signaling it remains prepared to enforce passage and respond to developments on ground. Now, this has effectively turned the Strait of Hormuz into a dual control zone, where every vessel movement carries risk and every decision at sea could have wider consequences. So let's take a look at how all of this is impacting the Brent crude price. It has crossed $100 per barrel. This is a graph to tell you about the steep hike that we are looking at. Before the war began on the 27th of February, the price of Brent crude was $72.97 per barrel. And now you can see the sharp hike, $102 per barrel. And we're talking about the latest, April 13th. Of course, there were a lot of ups and downs. The markets also kept responding to how there were talks taking place with signs of de-escalations coming in at different point in regular interval. But once again, the sharp hike is evident, $102 per barrel. Let me go across to my colleague Srinjoy, who's getting us more details. And there'll be further increase in the Brent crude price because the situation remains uncertain. Now, as far as the Strait of Hormuz is concerned, this is additional risk. Now, there's Iranian Navy and now there's United States as well there fighting for control.
Yes, you're right. There are two or three things that really have happened. Initially, the Americans said, we'll just block the entire Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you do that, then you run the risk of troubling some of your allies and friends, like the Saudis, like Bahrain, like Kuwait, and so on. Now, therefore, Kuwaiti oil, Saudi oil, can come through the Strait of Hormuz, is what the Americans say, but not Iranian oil. Now, that is being done by blockading all Iranian ports. Now, once you do that, Iranian shipping gets bottled up. Now, if that happens, then Iranian exports of crude oil, which go, among other countries, principally to the Chinese, cannot go through. Now, that is something the Chinese will have something important to say about. Besides that, there can be confusion.
Right.
In a war-like situation, confusion is often inevitable. So it's entirely possible that the wrong tanker is targeted in the wrong place and wrong time.
In fact, Srinjoy, with the help of graphics, let's take a look at how this is all going to take shape on ground. Now, this is what will happen, given how US is talking about control there. This is the presence, the heavy US naval presence. There will be deployment of aircraft carriers, destroyers and cruisers and submarines as well. When you talk about air control, well, fighter jets and surveillance aircrafts could monitor all ship movements and also quickly respond to threats. Ships will be on radar. Oil tankers would be intercepted. They would be boarded and checked. And like Srinjoy was pointing out, possibly they could be turned back as well. Escalation fear, of course, one cannot ignore that. Ships that ignore orders, that turned off their tracking devices, they could be seized and fired upon as well. So there's a constant threat of being attacked. Then, of course, the high risk of conflict with Iran. Iran would likely respond with naval attacks, sea mines in the strait, and drone strikes as well. So uncertainty will continue, and there's also the high risk of escalation of the entire conflict. So what's next in the ongoing deadlock in the Strait of Hormuz, and what are the possible outcomes if tensions continue to escalate? At this stage, the situation remains highly uncertain, but there can be three major possibilities. First, there is a growing concern that India and parts of Asia could face an energy shortage if disruptions in the strait continue or worsen. Any sustained restriction in oil flow through this key choke point could directly impact supply chains across major importing economies. Number two, global markets are already on edge with fear that oil prices could spike further. A sharp rise in crude prices would not only hit transportation and fuel costs, but also trigger broader inflationary pressure across economies worldwide. And number three, the most serious concern remains the risk of escalation at sea. So this is going to be the repercussion if we are looking at escalation. For energy-dependent economies like India, any prolonged disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could have direct implications for fuel prices, supply chains, and overall economic stability. However, the bigger concern, of course, remains the escalation itself. Let's take a look at how India is heavily dependent as far as the import of crude oil is concerned. So India imports 88% of crude oil, and 50% of that comes through the Strait of Hormuz. India also imports 60% of the LPG needs. Now, of this, 90% comes through the Strait of Hormuz. India also imports natural gas. 54% of its natural gas is imported, and 50% of that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. So this is the kind of dependency on not just imports but Strait of Hormuz that India faces. Now we have some breaking inputs coming in on the broadcast as the war with Iran dragged on. Israel's interception rate has dropped sharply. At the start, as per data, only about 5% of the Iranian missiles got through. They were intercepted. But in the final week, that rose to 27%. So 27% missiles could go through. They were not intercepted. Most of the missiles that hit carried cluster munitions, and Israel did not have an effective, dedicated defense against them. Remember the Iron Dome that everyone talks about? Let's go across. Sinjay was getting us more details. Sinjay, I was just talking about the Iron Dome. Now, we're given to understand when the war started initially, only 5% of the missiles went through without interception, but that number has increased. It has reached 27% now.
Yes, initially at least 90% of the missiles were intercepted, which is why comparatively less damage would have happened. But once it goes up to 27%, then clearly, and also there are cluster munitions falling. That means these are falling in different places at the same time. It becomes more difficult to handle. So as a result, you could imagine that there could be more damage if cluster weapons were used, and also if interception rates became a little lower. So if it's 27%, that means 73% were intercepted, down from about 90%. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but it's actually a very significant number. Now, how much damage has resulted? Clearly, there must be considerable amount of damage to property, to buildings, infrastructure, ports, all of that.
All right, Sinjay, thank you very much for joining us on the broadcast with additional details. We're moving on now.